series. My name is Iris McFarlane, and I'm one of the graduate students here at SNR. I work in the Human Dimensions Lab. The Fall Seminar Series is a weekly seminar showcasing research and topics from UNL, as well as speakers from all around the world. As you've probably noticed, seminars this year are completely virtual and through Zoom, and all the seminars are on Wednesdays from 3:30 to 4:30. Some of the previous seminars have been recorded and are available on the SNR seminar webpage if you were not able to make it in person to those, so you can go back and watch them at your convenience. And as a note, there will not be a seminar next week. So 2 weeks from now, which is November 4th, will be the next one, and that is Dr. Christopher Schell. He'll be presenting Wealth, Race, and Wildlife, the Impacts of Structural Inequality on Urban Wildlife. We do ask that you turn off your video just to minimize any bandwidth issues and also to minimize disruptions by any potential Zoom bombers. Chats are directed only to the hosts. So after the talk and during the talk, if you think of any questions, go ahead and type them into the chat to me, and then I will read those questions to our speaker after she's finished. This week, our speaker is Dr. Dara Wald from Iowa State University. Dr. Wald's research is in environmental communication, focusing on the causes and consequences of public debate over the management of natural resources. Dr. Wald's research has been published in leading journals in the field of sustainability and funded by the National Science Foundation, the Morris Animal Foundation, as well as the USDA. One broad stream of her scholarship focuses on how contextual and psychological factors like emotions, values, and risk perceptions drive policy resistance and socio-political conflict over environmental management. Second stream of her work focuses on public engagement and communication to promote effective and sustainable decision-making and collaborative governance over land, wildlife, and water. And with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Wald. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Iris, for having me. Thank you for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm excited to share some ideas with you guys and then hopefully open it up to questions at the end. Iris, can you hear me and see everything okay?
Yep, everything looks good. Yeah, the main screen right now is you, so I don't know if you want to swap that at some point.
Oh, let me see. Let's see if that works. Is that good?
There we go.
Okay, great. Great. Okay, so before I start my presentation, I do want to acknowledge that this work was conducted on the island of Guam, which is home to the Chamorro people. And so I want to respectfully acknowledge the Chamorro people who have stewarded this land through the generations. As we talk about environmental change on Guam, it's really important to acknowledge that there is a long legacy of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that have occurred here and throughout the U.S., and that this work is a tribute to the Chamorro people, past and present. I work and spend a lot of my time thinking about place-based values and the legacy of place and changes to place on attitudes and conservation behavior. And even on collaborative social processes. And so I think it's important to start with my place. This is a picture of the place where I grew up. One of my favorite trails in the town, or I guess streets leads up to a trail. And I was fortunate enough to have a lot of experiences with nature in the outdoors and with wildlife when I was a kid. And I credit a lot of those experiences with my interest in biology and ultimately my undergraduate degree in biology and later my graduate degree in wildlife ecology with a focus on human dimensions and environmental communication. So I do have a degree in wildlife ecology and conservation, but it is focused on human dimensions. And in particular, I focus on environmental communication. I'm now in a communication school. Most of my work and teaching is on environmental communication and risk communication. But I have a couple of focus areas, as Iris mentioned. In shorthand, I look at the causes and consequences of environmental conflict and how we make effective decisions and develop collaborative processes that are both inclusive and effective. And I primarily worked on water, land, and wildlife. Those are my three sort of main focal areas. And I like this sign because I'm a child of the 80s, but also because I think a lot about collaboration and when and how to design it, and how do we use what we know about how people think and how they talk and how they relate to each other and to their environment, to promote equitable, effective, inclusive, and sustainable decision making that is collaborative. And what that means, I think, is up for debate. But I by no means suggest that collaboration is the only way to do either the work that I do or to do conservation, but I think it is becoming more and more necessary for a whole host of reasons. So I think a lot about collaboration and conflict in the context of invasive species management. It's one of the areas I've spent a lot of time on. And so I started my journey really looking at the debate over outdoor cats, and thinking about what drives conflict in this area and what are messages that might engage different groups on with different attitudes and beliefs about cats. As I said, I grew up in Florida, and cats are hotly contested in Florida and in other places as well, but particularly in places where you have warm weather, and cats spend an enormous amount of time outdoors in many of these places, and you have a very concentrated number of endemic or endangered species that cats might prey on or kill. And so in March, in March, when there were a few other things going on in the world, my book came out on this topic, Cats and Conservationists, which really looks at where this debate comes from and how it centers around this idea of what is valuable and who owns the outdoors and who has the right to use it in different ways. And not only am I thankful for Iris hosting this presentation and inviting me here, but she's acknowledged in this book because she helped me as an undergraduate student when she was at Iowa State, stay organized and look up references and contact sources and things like that. So it's great to get a chance to present this work here, but also thank Iris publicly for her work. All right, so in addition to that, at Iowa State, I am part of a center that is looking at how we return value to people in the land through research partnerships, and particularly in this context of a changing agricultural system. And so how do we do that and make sure that human values, both in terms of the values that they bring, but also the values that come back to them from land, from agricultural practices, are addressed and brought to the forefront. I'm also the PI of the Science Communication Project at Iowa State. And this is, as part of that project, I'm directing a grant proposal, or a grant project, excuse me, funded grant project looking at the role of trust and credibility in science and environmental communication. So that's a little bit of my background of who I am. And I think that's important for you guys to know because I think we often get labeled as one thing or another, but I wear a lot of different hats, as I'm sure all of you do. So that's a little bit of my background. I'm going to talk today about this project on Guam, and I'm going to mostly focus on some of the potential areas for social conflict over invasive species management. This is part of another hat that I wear in the Ecology of Bird Loss project, which is run by Haldra Rogers, who's a faculty member here at Iowa State in the Ecology and Evolutionary Biology program. She and I run this project, and it wouldn't have been possible without her enormous support and initiative for this project to happen. I also want to acknowledge Anne-Marie Gall, who was the graduate student on this project, who still is a graduate student on this project, and she ran all of the focus groups that I'm going to be talking about today. So this is a case study where this work was conducted on Guam, as I said, with this real focus on public support for invasive species management, what drives it, what might shift it from public support to social conflict. And I'm going to go through all the steps of the study, the results, the conclusions, and then maybe prompt you for some ideas about next steps. And I'd love for us to have a discussion about that. So for those of you who may not know where Guam is, it's a small island in the Pacific Ocean. It is of strategic importance to the United States because of its proximity to North Korea. It is also a beautiful, beautiful place. And it has a very long history with invasive species. One of the most notorious of those is the brown tree snake, pictured here, rendered by a local artist. This particular invasive species, the brown tree snake, has been identified as being responsible for the extirpation and extinction of 10 out of the 12 forest birds, which have currently disappeared on Guam. This is one who's in captivity. And so I want us for a moment to listen to a recording to bring us to this place and to try to imagine what it would be like to walk through forests with birds and forests without birds. So what the clip I'm gonna play you right now was recorded by my collaborator, Haldra Rogers.
This is Ladaren Tonki on Saipan. This is a now on Guam.
Okay, so the first one was with birds on Saipan, which is a neighboring island, and the second was, of course, the forests of Guam. Okay, so in addition to brown tree snakes on Guam, there are several other invaders that have come to the island in the last few years that have also created challenges for the ecology of the islands, but also for humans. This is one. This is the coconut rhino beetle. This particular insect decimates palm trees, and palm trees are a really important cultural species on the island. They're also a source of firewood and building materials, and this has had a real significant impact on the island. The island has also experienced invasions of little fire ants. It also has deer and wild pigs. So Guam has this long, long history with non-native and invasive species. And the reality is that whether you're talking about invasive species or wind energy or conservation of bats, no matter what you're talking about, working toward meaningful conservation in a peopled place is going to require really broad agreement and cooperation between stakeholders and individuals invested in the island and the place. And that's because public support can really influence your ability to get conservation action implemented, to manage it, to continue it successfully over a long period of time. Public support and public opposition, sort of conversely, can run the gamut from a whole bunch of different things. So support could include coming out to a rally, support could include donating to an organization, support could include coming out to plant trees. And the same thing is true of conflict. It can run from public protest to op-eds in the newspaper to political action or even legal action. And so several years ago, a review study was conducted by Estevez et al., where they looked at what is the social context for public support for invasive species management. And invasive species management is a sort of subcategory of conservation action. So there's a whole host of different conservation actions that you can have, but invasive species management is one type. And so after this review was finished, they created this diagram in their paper where they talked about how important the role of values, risk perceptions, and attitudes were in driving behavior. And of all the studies that they looked at, these were the sort of three consistent things that came out. Values in this context means core beliefs, and those are core beliefs about, our desired end states, what we think the world should look like or be, right? But they're also sort of our broad conceptualization of what's right and what's wrong. And the idea is that these values drive our perceptions of what's risky, what's not risky, what's humane, what's inhumane, and our attitudes about how we should be managing certain species or not. And then ultimately, those influence our behaviors and the decisions that we make to support a policy or to oppose a policy. And this large framework is based on this idea that there's a cognitive hierarchy in our brains, right? That we have these values which influence our perceptions and our attitudes and then ultimately our behaviors. So it is intentionally linear and it is intentionally hierarchical. My own work has suggested that while values are really, really important and they exist, there's also this idea of attitudes is incredibly important when it comes to the management of invasive species. And one particular point in which attitudes are very important is they influence whether or not we perceive a management strategy, a particular approach, as humane or effective. right? And that if we perceive that something is not humane and we perceive that something is ineffective, then we're not going to be supportive of it. And these particular, specific, narrow attitudes about management in itself are very important. In another important paper, Shackleton et al. Also found that attitudes specifically about whether or not you thought an animal was useful or culturally important or charismatic would also drive behaviors, and that was another really important kind of subset of specific attitudes that had real consequences for invasive species management and public support for management. And so on Guam, we were interested both in how stakeholders sort of broadly view conservation action and natural areas and invasive species, but also specifically how do attitudes factor into views about conservation action. And do we find what other people have found? Like, no work had been done in this region, but it has this long history of invasive species. Does something about the long history affect whether or not attitudes are important, and what could we learn from that? And so that's what we were really focused on in this study. To answer some of these questions, we conducted a series of focus groups, and I was able to go out to Guam with Anne-Marie and conduct this study. She led the focus groups. She's originally from Guam and has family in the area. And it's a very close-knit community, and so it's really important to have her lead these focus groups and be the one engaging with participants, although I was there to support this effort. Each focus group lasted about 1 to 2 hours, and they were all recorded and transcribed. We conducted structured interviews, or we tried to conduct structured interviews. Sometimes these became more semi-structured as community members would wander in and out of the discussion. We did conduct a quantitative pre-survey where we asked participants to rank their concerns and their priorities for management. We targeted long-term or native residents, so anybody who'd lived on the island for more than 10 years. Participants ranged in age from 20 to 90. There are about 67 people who this work reflects. We have conducted additional focus groups since then, as recent as this summer, but those aren't reflected here. They included a host of people with different affiliations, from environmental educators to technicians, managers, or scientists. We also looked at users who were both passive or limited or even active resource users, so anyone who never went to the natural areas, to people who walked and hiked there all the time, to people who were hunters, fishers, and medicine women or surahanas on the island. So we tried to get a really wide swath of participants. We also did started a pilot project on Saipan, the other island that I mentioned earlier, that was whose forest was pictured in that video I shared. And so, but those focus groups have not yet been transcribed. We used a method which is pretty common, or becoming, I guess, more popular in more qualitative work. It's called the constant comparative method. I generally start every project, especially if I'm trying to learn about a community or a new place, with a qualitative approach, although I do end up often using quantitative models and data. Quantitative approaches and data. But what I like about this particular qualitative approach is that it encourages, as a researcher, for you to be really reflexive and to have multiple different kinds of coding. And so it includes open coding, where you're really looking through broad themes, and then axial coding, where you let sort of what you found guide your next coding steps. And then finally, selective coding, if you find a term or something that you didn't think was there, but that you think is really important based on what you found in the data. It really encourages you to let the data guide your evaluation. And so in this particular case, as you saw in my research questions, trust was not something that we were explicitly looking for, but it very, very quickly became something that was important. And so we did some selective coding around the idea of trust and credibility in this project. Okay. So I'm gonna move to some of the results and some of the big themes and things that we identified. So the first of which was this idea that there were really serious, what were participants' management concerns and priorities for the island. And it was really interesting, even though we as researchers and often, the folks who are scientists and experts in this island were really focused on the management of invasive species, when we asked people really broadly about what they were concerned about, we got a whole host of responses. And many of them were not focused on invasive species. There were things like illegal dumping or climate change or coral bleaching or trash that were really, really important. So that was a really interesting finding. The other thing that came up a lot was this idea that it's a really small place, that it's a finite resource, the island is, and that it has limited resources. And so everybody knows what's happening to everybody. Everything is interconnected, and this idea of connectivity came up in a lot of different ways. The other thing that was really interesting is that the vast majority of the money that goes to Guam for restoration, conservation, and environmental mitigation goes to the brown tree snake work. It's been, millions and millions of dollars have been spent to try to remove brown tree snakes from the natural area on Guam because they prey on endangered and endangered species. But the public, when we ask these questions about, what are the things that you're worried about and what are the invasive species that you're concerned about, by and large, it was the coconut rhino beetle that people brought up, and they described it as devastating and really dangerous. And people spend a lot of time talking about that. The other thing that was really interesting is that people spend a lot of time talking about the benefits of hunting pigs and deer, and also some environmental benefits that they create by creating ruts, or I guess they weren't environmental, but benefits they create by creating ruts in the forest. It makes it easier to walk through the forest. And so there were some surprising results there that sort of conflicted from what environmental managers and scientists think about. This is an example of one of the challenges associated with the coconut rhino beetle. So when the coconut rhino beetle gets into coconut trees, it completely changes their appearance. The leaves fall off, the fronds fall off. Eventually you have a coconut tree that has no top at all. And so the coconut rhino beetle is systematically destroying coconut trees on the island. And this is a quote that one of the residents, one of the participants said about, who ever heard of Pacific Island without coconuts, right? That it's having such a dramatic impact on a species of tree that is very, very important, or on a tree that is very important culturally, socially, and economically for the island. The other big theme that came up under this idea of management was that participants often expressed frustration with management activities. Either they didn't understand them, they didn't know why they were being done, they didn't know what was happening with them, they didn't know how they were continuing, they didn't know how they were being funded. And there was also just this really clear desire from many of our participants to be really more actively engaged in the decision-making process, really actively engaged in what's happening on the island in terms of wildlife and land. And these are a couple of quotes that illustrate that. This is a participant saying, I definitely think that we just need to be much more proactive. So we're not sitting around waiting for our leaders to come up with a plan. That's just not realistic. Another quote that illustrates some of the frustration with the way things are being managed and dealt with in terms of land on Guam is this quote: even though the military is controlling the land, the resources belong to the people of Guam. And this idea that land was controlled by the military on Guam or the federal government was, this idea that was a frustration for many, many of the participants that we spoke to. So that leads really into this next theme that jumped out at us, and while it wasn't a part of our original research question, really became apparent in the process, which is what happens with qualitative work, right? You find something else that's important. And so before I jump into what we found about trust, I really quickly want to show you this model of trust and situate it in the literature. So this is from the organizational trust literature. And what this model is essentially saying is that trustworthiness, perceived trustworthiness of organizations or of individuals comes out of a truster, the person who's taking on the willingness to trust, their perception of the other person, the trustee, the person they're awarding trust, the ability and benevolence and integrity, right? So those three factors that comprise your perception of somebody else's trustworthiness, right? Their ability to get the job done, their benevolence or your feelings that like they're working in your best interest and not for their own selfish needs, and their integrity. How honest are they? How truthful are they? And I think it's really important to understand this before I show you the quotes, some of the quotes that I pulled up, because it becomes very quickly apparent that there is a lack of trust in some of the organizations that are involved in the management of invasive species on the islands. And so this is the first quote. Someone said, I never had a live person pick up the phone, and I've never had anybody call me back. Even though it says on the website, if you see this guide, call this number, right? I did my job. I called, you know, right? In other words, I'm doing what you asked me to do, but you either don't have the ability, the integrity, or the benevolence to do what I asked you to do, right? Like what you promised me you'd do. This is another quote suggesting that they don't really understand what management agencies are doing, right? One strategy that's happening on Guam is to drop mice. As you see this little small tube right here in the bottom coming down from the helicopter. It's a bucket with mice in it. And so they are doing aerial drops of mice on the island that have Tylenol in them, essentially, which kills the snakes when they ingest the mice. And so a couple of participants would talk about this. Yeah, I heard they were doing something with helicopters and they mice. They were throwing them in the jungle or shooting them in the jungle. It didn't work really. Like, I don't know what's happening. There's no real follow through, right? Again, questioning sort of the ability of the agency and their benevolence to do this work and to do it well and to be transparent about it. And I put these pictures side by side because I think it's important to highlight the fact that this story and the sort of recurrence of this image of a helicopter today and a previous helicopter. So in the 1950s, Guam was sprayed, the island was sprayed with DDT. And this was done in an effort to protect troops primarily from mosquito-borne diseases. And many of the people that we interviewed, especially because we were interviewing many older people on the island, remember this vividly. They remember seeing trucks coming through the town. They remember seeing helicopters flying over. And they have equated that spraying of the island with DDT as the reason for the decline of birds on Guam. Now, the scientific evidence that was collected in the 1980s looked at DDT as a factor in the decline of birds on the island and did not find evidence that widespread, that birds, the declines that they were seeing in the bird population could be associated with DDT or could be caused by DDT. And instead, the scientific evidence pointed to the brown tree snake. But many participants on the island, and this was reflected in our interviews time and time again, did not believe that and would talk about these very vivid stories of remembering DDT being sprayed and remembering seeing birds dying immediately after the spraying. And so this is a quote that reflects that skepticism of the scientific narrative, right? That they were saying, like, I don't want to, military and the agencies don't want to admit it, right? They're funneling all this money into brown tree snake management when ultimately it's the DDT that killed the birds, right? And so this is a question about the honesty and the integrity of the management decisions that are being made. And this is another one that just goes to that idea about managers aren't doing what they need to be doing for me. They're not being benevolent, right? And it's this last sentence, right? That I just think that, the environmental folks on this island are just stretching out their job as long as they can through their retirement, right? So they're not working for me. They're working for their own good. And so if you go back to this organizational trust literature and you think about, right, what this model is saying and how it applies to some of the quotes that we're seeing, it becomes very apparent very quickly that perceptions of management of invasive species are intertwined with perceptions of the trustworthiness of these agency actors. Now, I don't want to imply that trust, that there's no trust at all. There are some organizations on the island that were highly respected and trusted and came up in multiple participants' comments. The first was the University of Guam, that was a place where people really thought, like there's some really cool, innovative, and important research that's being done. And the other one was when you asked people about individual managers, individual people or scientists that they had interacted with. That was when people would talk about, you go straight to the source in order to find out about stuff. And, this is where I get my trusted information from. So the last big theme that I'll talk about before I turn over to a discussion is this idea of how people value nature. So we asked participants at the outset to describe pristine areas on the island. Where is a pristine place? And that's all we asked. And we got very different responses. In general, when we asked participants about pristine areas, if those participants came from indigenous communities, and particularly Chamorro communities, they talked about their Chamorro ancestors and how a piece of land, a place on the island was considered pristine if they knew that their ancestors had walked there. If there were stories reflective in Chamorro narratives that reflected on this particular place, then they knew it was a pristine place because they could feel in the earth or in the rocks as they would walk out that they were smooth, which was a sign that their ancestors had been walking through that area. Here's another example of that. Unless it's been trampled on or walked in by ancient folks way back, then then it's not a good. The implication here is that then it's not a good area, right? That the good areas are the ones where you know that other people, and in particular your ancestors or other Chamorro ancestors, have walked. When we asked this question of managers or of folks who had lived on the island for a long time but weren't originally from the island and not indigenous, we got very different responses. This particular participant said ideal areas are those where you just don't see any invasive species or no humans at all, right? No signs of people, either past or present. This is another example. We're talking about the third of the island that we don't have access to. In other words, where people are kept out, those are the areas that are pristine. And other scholars have sort of talked about this idea that there are differences in values. They call them, often call them worldviews. This idea that you can have dualistic and mutualistic worldviews, the idea that people are either separated from nature in a dualistic sense, or people are really connected to nature in this interconnectedness of nature and people and this sort of mutualistic association. And so we definitely weren't surprised necessarily to find that because other scholars have talked about it. But I think what's really interesting on Guam is I think it has really important implications for communicating and engaging with the public. And I'll highlight those right now. So sort of broad conclusions, I definitely found some evidence that there is a desire to engage. I don't know how many of you have tried to engage the public on topics of environmental interest, but I've been in a lot of situations where there's evidence of apathy, right? I just don't care. I don't have the time to deal with this. I've got other stuff going on, right? And so I think that when you find evidence of a desire from the public to engage in something, it's a real gem. It's a really important finding. And it's something that should be acknowledged and should be reciprocated, right? If there's a desire to engage and participate in a behavior, you have an opening, right? And I think that's really important. The other thing that is important to remember from a communication perspective is that when you have controversy, when you have evidence of distrust, as I believe we do here, makes communicating the science much more complex, much more challenging, right? You have to build trust in order to engage, right? How do you do that? That's a really complicated, long process. And so it's complex. It's not as simple as providing information. It's really got to be much more engaged and thoughtful. The other thing that I think is really important to remember is that different audiences are going to react really differently once something has become controversial, once there's evidence of distrust. And I think we saw that difference reflected both from the values perspective, but also in this idea that the agencies themselves are viewed in one way, right? And then the individual managers or scientists are viewed in a different way. And so it's going to be really important to think about how you frame those different audiences, how you frame your different actions, and how you relate them to the different sources of information that are currently available on Guam. And then I'm going to bring back the theory, right? This model that I showed you at the very beginning based on the cognitive hierarchy designed by Estevez et al. I think there's a real opportunity here to think about how trust fits into this model. It was something that was sort of a footnote in the original Estevez article, but I think it really deserves a lot of attention. In part because, especially in contexts where you already have signs of conflict or signs of long history of management, right? You've probably had little scuffles of trust along the way, right? And so when you have those contexts, if you ignore trust, it's not, it's not going to go away, right? These things tend to simmer and they have long-standing implications for your ability to conserve species or to engage public communities of lay people. And so I've sort of embedded trust here off to the side because it's not directly been connected in the literature in this way yet, but I do think it belongs there. And I would argue that this idea of different values between the managers is going to have real implications for trust, right? If you feel like a manager doesn't understand you and does not value you or your opinion or does not have the same values as you, how are you ever going to feel like they're working in your best interest, right? Because your values are so different. You can't possibly agree. And so I think understanding the role of values, and particularly this idea of dualistic and mutualistic values varying between agencies and the community, wherever that may be, I think that's a really important thing to explore. The other sort of part of this is that I think it's really important to understand how trust influences risk perceptions, attitudes, and behaviors in this context, in the context of invasive species management. If you remember back to the organizational trust literature, perceived risk is there, right? It's in this model. And so I think the question is, how does it apply in the context of invasive species management, or when you have a long history of management in a complex context where there is evidence of distrust? What happens to perceived risk in those contexts? And lastly, because I tend to then move from qualitative to quantitative, I wanted to end with this model, which is something that I've been thinking about a lot in terms of the factors and the variables that might influence both trust and also behavior. And one of the things that's really interesting about trust is it's been defined in lots of different ways by lots of different people. And so one of the things that I think is particularly interesting about the case of Guam is that we generally think that trust leads to behavior, right? In other words, if you want people to do something, they have to trust you first. Well, what's interesting about the evidence that we found on Guam is that participants are doing what we're asking them to do, right? Not me and not you, but what the managers are asking them to do. Managers are putting out posters and saying, call us, report on these species. And the participants are doing it. But they're not doing it because they trust the agency. If anything, they're doing it knowing that the agency isn't going to respond to them, and they have experience with not responding, and they're still calling and they're still doing the behavior. And so I think it highlights this idea that, we still have some more work to understand conceptually how trust operates, right? What actually drives it, and these different forms of trust, right? The choice to go ahead and commit to the uncertainty that another person is not going to do what you want them to do, right? Is that the same thing as your willingness to accept that you might get hurt, or is it a slightly different thing, as some scholars have suggested? And so how trust is defined in this context, what influences it, and also how that influences behavior, and which pathways you can get in which pathways can you get to behavior that you want when you might have a history of distrust, which we know is there, and which we know in many communities can really affect the ability to conserve or to develop collaborative processes. So on that thought, I will stop, and I'd be happy to answer questions or discussion. My email address is up there, along with Twitter, although I'm woefully bad at posting on Twitter. But here is some of this work was covered in the article that's cited there as well, for those of you who are interested. So.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wald, for sharing that with us. If anyone has questions, please type them into the chat, and we will read those to Dr. Wald so she can answer them. Or comments, or any thoughts about it?
While we're waiting for questions to come in, sometimes it takes a little bit to get it rolling here. How is the management agency the same as the military? Is the management agency the military, and is that where a lot of the distrust is coming from, as a occupying force, or something like that?
It's a great question. So unlike, so in Iowa, we have state actors that manage lands. We have local actors who manage lands, and we have federal, not in near us, but in the United States. Guam is a sort of a different place. Everything is managed through the federal government. So the Division of Fish and Wildlife is federal, and every part of the island that is under their control that is pristine or considered valuable land is either, I won't say every part, but most of it is under, Fish and Wildlife Service or under the military control. And so I think that they are conflated, those two organizations, in a way that they're not in other places. And I think that really does have an impact. And I think what you're hinting at, this idea that militarization and occupation has created, has been just a prominent force in this region, but also on this island. And I think it has a long, long tail, in the sense that I think we still see the reverberations of this, these conversations, these feelings, this frustration today because of that. And I'm not an expert in militarization at all, but there's some really amazing tomorrow scholars who are doing work in this space that I think is really valuable and important to think about.
Thanks.
Yeah, great question.
Chris, do you have any questions in your chat? I'm not seeing any yet in mine.
Nope, I haven't gotten any yet.
It's a sleepy gray day. I'll wake people up a little bit. One thing that I thought was really interesting about your results was the difference between how people thought of pristine spaces. I guess I've always had my own definition of that, and I've never even considered some of the responses you got. So how do you think that, I don't know, I guess, like, how do you think that throws a wrench in, or could be, like, how does that affect the conservation efforts?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, and Chris, you can probably attest to this, right? In the human dimensions world, right, values they're sort of this enduring basic thing that we all have, right? And the idea isn't that we go straight from our values to behaviors, right? The idea is that, at least in the human dimensions world, often it's conceptualized as going from values through to beliefs, perceptions, attitudes, maybe norms are somewhere in there too, and then to behaviors, right? The idea that you have to go from, it's not a direct shot. And so I think in terms of knowing exactly how values themselves influence people's behavior, I think that's a challenging one to answer, because the way it's generally conceptualized is that there are these steps that you have to go through, cognitively at least. But I think it has real implications for communication, because, when I see a message that rubs up against, in a sort of abrasive way, my value, contradicts my beliefs about the way the world should be, or about what's right and what's wrong, which is how we generally define values, I tend to reject it, right? How many of you have unfriended someone after something they've said politically really upset you, right? Or you've decided, like, oh, it's not worth the headache, right? And so I think from a communication standpoint, if we aren't acknowledging that there are different worldviews and values here, or strongly held beliefs, however you want to call it, right? We call it multiple things in the literature. If we don't acknowledge the existence of those differences, I think we run a real risk of creating communication that people potentially ignore or reject, right? And so understanding who your audience is and what they care about before you even start your campaign is incredibly valuable. And so, so I think that's one of the most, I think for me, that's one of the areas where I think we need to go back and understand a little bit more about. And so I'm my graduate student, Anne-Marie Gal, who did all these focus groups, and I are currently looking at our old transcripts and also some new ones to probe a little bit more deeply to this idea of dualistic, mutualistic values and where they appear, and also looking at some differences between the islands, right? Because we did do studies on Guam and on Saipan, and they have a very different history, both in terms of occupation, militarization, but also in terms of environmental resources. They don't have the brown tree snake on Saipan. And so the forests look very different and sound very different, and people engage it with the forests, I think, in a very different way, at least based on some, my trips out there and some of the experiences that I've had out there. And so, yeah, so understanding that, I think, is that's one of the next things I want to dig into more. And and I'm hoping to partner with, as I said, some of the awesome tomorrow scholars who are doing work in this space, because I think it's really important to do that work with someone who is embedded in the community in a different way than I am. So, yeah.
I've got a couple questions here, Iris. They're kind of related to the pristine spaces question that Iris just asked. This is from Brianne Wolf. Absolutely fascinating presentation. Thank you, Dr. Wald. Quite an interesting finding about the preference or the difference in perception of pristine posed to people of the land and then to the conservation environmentalist non-native people. Was the term pristine a question for you in terms of how people responded? Not sure if it was potentially a language factor or a translation understanding of that term, pristine.
That's a really great question. We asked that question in that way to everybody, and then if they asked questions about the term, I think we had a line in our survey, in our interview script, about how we defined that. And so we defined it the same way for everybody. But I think you go to this point that I think is really important, which is that language is contested, and it is formed based on sort of cultural practices and norms in the place. And so one of the reasons that we wanted to focus on people who'd been there for a long time was that assumption that the place itself and the language that's used in this place is shaped and informed by those experiences. But I think that it's certainly connected. The language that we use and the values that we have are, I believe, interconnected. And so it's a great point. And we didn't explore that necessarily further, but we were careful about trying to define it the same way for everybody. Thank you, Brian. Great question.
Another one, this one's from Larkin. Thanks for the great seminar and wonderful visuals with your quotes. What kind of advice do you have for folks who want to work internationally, at least off continent?
Gosh. So I think just my personal feelings about the work that we do in the conservation world. And I think this was something my former chair said years ago when I was a graduate student. And he said that, conservation is a normative field. In other words, we bring our values with us, right? We imply by the name of what we do that conserving is a valuable and important thing to do. And I think one of the things I have learned, both growing up where I grew up in a place where my values were often not the same as the people that I was surrounded by, and my friends and I would have very heated conversations about lots of topics, that I think it's really important when you have, when you're doing work or working with people who have very different values and beliefs than you do, or grew up in a different place than you did, or had a different set of experiences. I think it's important to be incredibly humble and open to listening more than talking. And I also think that sometimes we talk to people thinking about changing their behavior. And I think it's more important to talk to people to understand where their behaviors come from and to build trust and a relationship before you jump into any conversations about sort of the behavioral part of what people do. And so I think in the international context, that's really important. And so I would say that finding partners who grew up in the place that you want to work, finding partners who've been embedded in the community for a long period of time is incredibly important. I think that, as a young researcher, I thought it would be easier to do the work, and I didn't realize the importance of sticking around and building relationships. And I think that's the most important thing you can do, because I think that trust is a relationship building process. And I think it's necessary to do work, whether it's international or local. So I would say find partners, take opportunities when they come to you, but be ready to be humble and listen.
So I've got a couple questions too.
I've got one more too, so you can ask yours and then I'll ask.
Okay. This one's from Ani Petzel. I'm sorry if I butchered your last name, Ani. She's wanting to know, how do the native Guam community members feel they can combat this feeling of not being listened to, but willing to engage?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really interesting question. So I can't speak for obviously the entire community, and I don't live there, so I don't know those feelings in the intensity that I think someone who lives there does. But based on our interviews, especially with folks who are very connected in an active way to resources, folks who are Surahanas, medicine women, or hunters or fishers, I think one of the things I heard time and time again was a feeling that that there was an importance of acknowledging ownership of the land, and access to the land and to the resources were important, and a feeling like those concerns had not been heard. I think it's really interesting, to step back a little bit from the context of Guam. I do think it's interesting to think about how people reconcile disparate feelings. Some of you may be familiar with the idea of cognitive dissonance, that when we come across a belief or and something that contradicts other beliefs, we feel cognitively uncomfortable, and we try to resolve that in some way. And sometimes we can shift our behavior. Sometimes we could try to change maybe our beliefs or our attitudes about something. And one of the other things I didn't present, but I think that is really interesting, was a couple of participants expressed a real appreciation for the military, because they had members and family members who served in the military. And so Guam has a very high rate of people who are actually in the military, much higher than any other state in the US. And so I think it is an interesting and complex dynamic there about how people feel about military control over land. There have been lots of controversies, public and covered in the news, about new sighting of bases and army ranges. And again, I'm not a military specialist, but I think that the best thing I could say is that it's a really complex relationship. And I think just like in any place, right, there's not one opinion or one attitude about it. I think if you ask 10 people, you'll get 10 responses and 10 different feelings expressed. And so I think to me, what I took away from it was a need to do more deep work in that space and better understand the long history of militarization and land degradation and change that has been associated with it in this region.
I've got another question from Caitlin Kirby. She says, I'm interested in the difference in trust in individuals versus institutions. I'd be interested in hearing more about it generally from this study, or if it factors into the theoretical frameworks of trust and behavior.
Yes, and it does often. Trust is very context specific. And so literature and a host of topics, including an environmental context, have talked about the difference between interpersonal trust and organizational trust, and even social trust, which is a third kind of thing, where it's like, generally, how do you generally trust people in society? How trusting are you of people in society? And the work in trust is both fascinating and daunting. Like, I get into it and I can spend lots of time just like, okay, how do I define trust in one paper? And so there's some great work in this space by Mark Stern, who's at Virginia Tech, and Joe Ham, who's at Michigan. state, and so who've done a lot more work in thinking about trust than I have, and I have been fortunate just to learn from them. There's also really important differences, I think, in how we define trust and distrust. And so in general, the literature on individual and organizational trust has suggested that people hold different attitudes about an organization than they do about an individual. And that positive experiences with an individual, procedural justice, fairness, transparency, things like that can really make a difference in processes where there is distrust. But that it is, if we think about it, it's a little bit easier to demonize like an organization than it is an individual. Especially if you've had one-on-one contact with that individual, if your friends know that, if you're friends with that person, or friends with other friends of that person. So there is quite a bit of literature on that, and the general consensus is that generally people trust individuals more than they do organizations. But if you're interested I have folders and folders of articles on trust. So if you're interested, email me after the talk and I can give you some stuff to think about and to read.
Do you have any more, Iris?
Yeah, I've got one more from Ani.
Okay.
She says, you mentioned the native Guam people trust scientists or experts and the University of Guam. Are these scientists and the university limited in any way by harnessing the trust of the community and managing invasive species more effectively? And she also says, thank you, Dr. Wald, for sharing your research knowledge and community engagement work with us.
Thank you. Can you repeat the first part of the question? Are they limited? Is the University of Guam limited?
Yeah, are these scientists and the university limited in any way by harnessing the trust of the community and managing invasive species more effectively?
Are they limited? I'm not sure if I would say that they are limited. I guess maybe they are in some ways, right? Because many of the individuals that work for the UOG or work for these agencies are guided by the agencies or the organization's goals and mission. And so in some sense, they are limited. The other thing here, and I alluded to it when I showed the map of Guam, like a large portion of the land is managed and owned by the federal government. And so in some senses, the university and these individual scientists are limited by those organizations, right? Because the federal agencies are the ones who have to approve the reintroduction of any species or have to approve how these decisions are made. And so in some ways, everybody on the island is limited by that big factor. And so I think where the University of Guam and where individual scientists could be really are moving towards, and I think could be effective, is understanding what happens not on federally owned land. Like, how can conservation be created, enacted, perpetuated, or restored on property that isn't owned by the federal government, in smaller spaces in urban areas, in small yards or gardens, in open space that maybe hasn't been used for federal purposes yet. And I think that's where I see some opportunities for future restoration in a creative way. I think the other way in which they're limited is, and I think this is true not just on Guam, I think this is true across wildlife agencies and organizations, there's this recognition that we need to move towards a more networked approach. There's an article, I'm blanking on her name. There's a great article that talks about how we've transitioned from this hierarchical top-down model of governance, right, of decision-making in wildlife and conservation contexts, to a more networked and engaged approach. And I think what's really important for that is that I think there's this recognition that we need to do it. I think there's just some questions about how we do it, right? Like, how do we actually engage people who want to be engaged? How do we actually make participatory processes truly equitable? I think there's some really amazing work in that space that's being done and trying to do that work. But there are also, like, right, in places where we have this history of distrust and powerful people and powerful interests, how do you overcome that, right? We make often vague generalizations and assumptions about overcoming power and building trust. But on the ground, that's really hard to do. And it's really hard to do successfully. And it's hard to overcome, right? I keep talking about it as this long history, but I think it's like this long tail that has all these implications. But that's because I think it does. And I think we often assume that, like, that history of distrust or those power dynamics are outside of the collaborative process. But in some of my articles and other work I've talked about, and I really believe that it's like, it is the process, right? Like, it's all over the process. And so, even from the very beginning, like, deciding who to bring into the collaborative process is an exercise of power. And so, so I think that's just a huge question. Yeah.
All right, I've got one more from Daniel. You kind of hit on this a little bit already. Are there plans to repeat this case study for other U.S. minor islands or any other island communities?
I would love to. I would love to. There are plans to build on this work in the Marianas, and there are discussions about maybe Hawaii, but it's a bigger place and it's harder to do work there. I am starting a project with collaborators on Rhoda to look at bat management and conservation of bats, and sort of where we go from there. And what we do just depends on funding and time and ability to travel, which right now we can't. So yeah, it just depends on a lot of things. I would love to continue this work. I've learned so much in this process, and I feel like I've learned, again, as I said, humility and patience, and I think that's been really incredibly valuable, both personally and professionally.
Excellent. Last call for question. I don't think there's any more. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. And thank you, Iris, for hosting. So,
thank you so much for inviting me, for the wonderful questions. And Iris, great to see you. And thank you for inviting me, and Christopher for hosting it. So Thank you.
Absolutely. Have a good one.
Thank you again.